QALYfied, Episode 2, COVID Testing Explained. A quick note from Augustus here. In the podcast, we throw around the terms QALY and DALY rather casually, and sometimes stray away from the absolute definitions. So I wanted to just add a definition and a clarification here if you haven't encountered these terms before. QALY, spelled QALY, is an acronym for Quality Adjusted Life Year, which is a measure of the quality and quantity of life lived. A QALY of 1 is living with perfect health, and a QALY of 0 is death. DALY, spelled DALY, stands for Disability Adjusted Life Year, which is a measure of disease burden. DALY is calculated by the years of life lost and the years lived with disability. That's about it. Once again, in the heat of the discussion, we might use the terms loosely and broadly, but rest assured, we do know what they mean. And now, you do too. So on with the show. Hello, healthcare nerds. Welcome to QALYfied, the podcast where we talk about the business and science of medical technology in a fun, sassy, and analytical way. I'm your host, Augustus, the overnight VC, and I started the healthcare practice at one of the most active health tech VCs in Singapore and Southeast Asia.
And hi, my name is Yan Lin, a medtech industry insider and your awkward friend who talks about industry so you don't have to.
Okay, so let's go into today's topic, which is...
Well, I thought today we're gonna basically do part 2 on diagnostics.
Okay.
Because so nothing I said in the last one I will take back, but I think it bears clarification.
So remind me about what we actually talked about the last time.
So we talked about basically COVID diagnostics and
right.
the why or why not do you use some tests versus other tests, and why is there a
Right.
difference as to what is a 10-minute test or 15-minute test versus a
Yeah.
3-day test, why
Yeah.
is there such a big difference? And I think one of the things that I talked about was I addressed your question, which is the two big ones that people know about, which is the sort of antibody test, which is like the lateral flow, looks like a pregnancy test strip test, versus molecular diagnostic tests, which are PCR based.
So the first one, at least, we'll have to describe it. It's one of those things where you're supposed to get like a really fast turnaround of the results.
Yeah.
So can you describe a little bit about what the process is like for that one?
Right. So for these kind of antibody tests, which it's put in a format called a lateral flow. And a lateral flow is basically a piece of material that kind of looks like paper, but it's actually not. There's a little bit more sophistication than that allows liquid to wick from one side to the other side in a controlled manner. And so although it looks like a very simple piece of paper, actually it's kind of engineered so it wicks at a certain amount of time, So basically that's
Capillary action.
Yes. But as fast or as slow as you need to get the right level of accuracy. And what happens is basically on these pieces of cellulose, you deposit usually a line of basically something that captures the thing that you're looking for. Okay, so in the case of antibody test, right, you're looking for antibodies. So you stick something that can capture an antibody that is unique to that on the paper. And basically when you put in the sample, it basically flows through and then picks up basically if it's present, and then it forms a line on the other side.
Right.
Usually using either gold or latex particles so that you have a visual signal on the other side.
Right.
So that, although it looks very simple, it's simple because there's been decades of innovation that has gone into these things, and that's why you can mass manufacture them, at the scale of millions. And that's also the reason why the way that you do the test is so simple, because they've been using these kind of platform for a lot of diagnostic tests already. For example, like HIV or
pregnancy tests.
Pregnancy tests, exactly. So that category of test is probably the one that people wish could be accurate enough to be used just about everywhere.
Right.
And it is cheap enough because at scale, it is something that can be manufactured at dollars per piece.
Right.
So it makes a lot of sense why people want them.
Right.
But the thing about antibody tests is it only tells you that you've had an infection, not that if right now you're infectious or not.
I see.
And so it's useful to use these tests to get a sense of what the prevalence is of that disease in a population, but it doesn't really tell you necessarily if you're at danger or not. Okay, so for example, in scenarios where it's a chronic condition like HIV, it's good because at any time you want to know. So it doesn't really matter if it's an antibody or antigen test, right? Basically, you just want to know whatever it is. But in other, like COVID, for example, you may only be infectious for a short period of time.
That's right.
After which it doesn't matter. It's nice to know, but clinically, what can you do with that information?
Yeah.
So there's that basically.
Yes.
Right now, there are companies out there that are launching in this kind of lateral flow platform antigen tests.
Right.
So that's capturing basically the bug, the virus that you're actually looking for. Right? You're looking at particles that are on the virus that you're capturing on this lateral flow strip, and so it does tell you if you have active infection or not.
And to compare the form factor, the way this is being done versus the PCR method, which is the gold standard right now.
Yeah. So there's a lot of difference, and I will explain a term that becomes very important when we talk about diagnostic tests. So in the last podcast, I talked about sensitivity and specificity.
Right.
And I used it in a very colloquial way, which is how people tend to understand it. If I say it's sensitive, it means what's my chances of being able to detect this thing, right?
Sure.
So for example, there's a population of 100 people. If I can, and there's, 3 people in that 100 that have it.
Yeah.
If I test 100 people, I will always detect 3. That's 100% sensitivity, right? But it's a slightly different thing when you compare a molecular test, like a PCR test, with a lateral flow test. And that's another term that becomes really important, which is called limit of detection.
Okay.
So what is limit of detection? Limit of detection literally means what is the smallest amount of something that you can detect using this platform.
Right.
Okay.
So like the minimum amount of matter that you're trying to identify.
Yes.
Okay.
So basically, it's like what's the minimum amount of particles or virus or DNA, depending on whatever your test method is, that can be used to give you a positive signal.
Sure.
Okay. PCR tests are much more sensitive than lateral flow tests in terms of limit of detection.
Okay, so that means that for a lower amount of matter, it's going to be more, you're just going to be more accurate in a way, like colloquially, it's going to be more accurate with a PCR versus with an LFA.
Yeah, so accuracy, again, this is where
it's
a different term, right? So if we're talking about like industry jargon, all these terms that we use colloquially are not the same.
Right.
Right? There's actually different math that goes behind what you qualify these different terms as. So limit of detection is usually things like they say X number of viral particles per 10 milliliters or something.
Sure.
And that's my limit of detection. So if I have a vial of 10 millimeters with that amount of concentration of the thing I'm looking for, I can say my test will say yes when it's in there. Okay?
Related to a specific sensitivity level.
Yeah, the specific quantity of material that you're looking for.
Yeah.
Okay. So below that, basically your test cannot detect it.
Right. Or at least I don't stand by it. Yeah.
Yeah. So this becomes very important because lateral flow tests have a higher, need a higher, boundary to detect something than a PCR test. Right. And the reason being a PCR test, you can replicate the thing that you're looking for. So in this case, you're replicating the viral, basically DNA. I think it's actually RNA. In order to detect the thing. You can't do that with a lateral flow test. There is no amplification. So as many particles as there is, that's all you get. Right? You don't get more.
That's right.
So therefore, it is going to be less in terms of sensitivity if you think about it colloquially, but it's actually lower.
Wouldn't that be compensated by the amount of sample, like instead of just one sample stick, you get 2?
No, so the thing is it's all about dilution.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? So in basically the way that samples are taken right now is nasopharyngeal swabs,
Yes.
right? So you put it up to the nose and
Yeah.
basically swab
Yeah.
what feels like your brain,
Yeah.
and then you pull it back out.
Yes.
So what you do in, for example, the newest approved antigen lateral
Yeah.
flow test
Yeah.
is by Beck and Dickinson, and their method is you basically take the swab and you put it in what looks like a little test tube
Yeah.
that has some liquid in it.
Yeah.
Okay, and you go in there and you twist it around, and then you take it out, close the cap, and then you squeeze basically three drops onto your diaphragm, and then you basically wait the allotted amount of time, which I believe for their test is 15 minutes,
Yeah.
and then a read is made, yes or no.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the method where basically the liquid that's in that little test tube is the media
Yeah.
that carries through. And so if you have the same swab for a higher volume of media, you're just washing it out anyway. So this is part.
Same swab, but if you had two swabs.
So, I mean, it's like, how much can you capture on the, like how many times do you want to do it, right?
Twice.
So, because a lot of the swabs you're already
Yeah.
doing in both nose.
Yeah, that's right. That's
So
right.
then-
oh, you're really doing
Yeah,
both
you're
nose.
already
I
doing
see.
both nose.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
A lot of times, at least the one that I took anyway. You did both nose.
I see.
But essentially the idea is that if it's there, it's going to be there.
Yeah.
And, it's about your limit of detection.
Yeah.
So basically for the lateral flow test strips,
Yeah.
because they don't have replication,
Yeah.
it means that they have, a higher limit of detection than a PCR test.
Yeah.
So when we talk about, okay, what does this mean in a population level? It means, for example, you only start developing, let's say, antibodies 4 to 10 days from your point of infection.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so if you have an antibody lateral flow test and you did it day 1 to 4, potentially you didn't capture anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So
That's right.
it's not accurate. Potentially, even as an antigen test, the number of, viral particles that you're trying to capture is so small in the early days because it hasn't ramped up yet that basically you would get a false negative, basically, because it's not sensitive enough.
Yeah.
Basically, you can't detect it well enough. And so that's why there's usually a repeat test for a lot of the lateral flow tests, especially for things that matter and you're not quite sure when the immune response is going to happen.
Yeah.
So for example, in HIV tests, again, it's been many decades since they created these lateral flow tests for HIV. They're already in the 4th generation of tests. And so they're very good already, very sensitive comparatively. But they still say, if you have a negative that first time you took the test, you had to come back at least 6 months out to take it again, because the chances you may not have detected the antibodies and antigens enough in your blood in order to do that test well. So that's always the worry with these lateral flow tests, because there's a line, a cutoff line as to when it's not relevant. Right. And it depends on person to person as well when your body reacts to things.
So we put this in the context of what's currently being considered for COVID-19 screening. The one is what's currently being considered the gold standard, which is the PCR test. It takes a longer time because the sample needs to go into a lab to get amplified and then run through a PCR. And usually that takes about 3 days before you get the results, versus what we're talking about, what you've just talked about, which is the lateral flow format. One, for example, is the BD Beck and Dickinson rapid antigen kit that gives you supposedly some kind of a result very quickly without the need for it going back to the lab. So that means that it's less sensitive, but the time, the turnaround time is much faster, so it's more convenient. So there's a bit of a trade-off.
So this is where your disease prevalence in the community becomes important. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, every test, like I said last time, will not have 100% sensitivity or specificity. It just will not have. So even your very best test, they'll only say 99%. Okay. So what does that mean, 99%? So it means, let's say you have 100 people, right?
Yeah.
And maybe I should play with the numbers a little bit larger because it starts becoming a little funky after a while.
It becomes funky. Yeah.
So let's say we have 1,000 people, okay, and your prevalence in the community is only 1%.
Yeah.
Which means that only 10 people out of that 1,000 have this disease.
Yeah.
Okay. And then even your very best test, let's say you have sensitivity 99%.
Yeah.
Right? So what does that mean? It means that out of 99 positive, you capture 99 positives out of a total of 100 positives. So you have one false positive, basically, right? So where it becomes funny is that false positive in low prevalence becomes an issue.
Yeah.
Because you're telling lots of people that they have
low prevalence
the
becomes
disease.
an issue. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're basically telling lots of people potentially that they have the disease when they don't. Right. And then that becomes what we call a positive predictive value. Right. What's your chances that the positive that I give you is actually a true positive?
Right.
Right. And the math sort of works out that, let's say in populations where there's low prevalence, you're always going to have more false positives than a true positive because there's very few true positives actually in the arena.
Sure.
So it becomes like let's say 1 in 11 becomes a true positive. So now your healthcare system has to take care of 11 people as a next step rather than one person as a next step. So then you have to have the second level of retesting or potential partial quarantine until the PCR test comes back. So it becomes very complicated because you have to track and trace all these false positives. Okay. Same is true for false negatives as well. So that's where your specificity comes into play. Where again, if you have low prevalence, none of these tests are 100%, which means you're going to have a segment that is false negative. Right? That's even more dangerous because then you're letting all these people out into the world and telling them you're fine, but they are spreading disease. Right? So then it becomes very complicated. So this is why there's been quite a lot of head scratching, let's put it that way, in industry as when is the right time or how do you do a mass screening program in a community with very low prevalence, like Singapore.
Yeah, so I guess this is where it starts to make sense to put it within the context of some concrete examples. So maybe we can put 3, and as we start to talk about the PCR, I should probably disclose that the company which I'm working with is representing Fort Richard Labs, which is one of the dominant providers of viral transport media. So obviously they do have a bit of an incentive when it comes to the use of PCR, as an example. But let's talk about 3 different countries. So you've got the US on one side, which we know is pretty much everyone's cousin and their grandmother has something. And it's just very high. It's very high prevalence. You've got Singapore somewhere in the middle. It's kind of managing things, I would say. And there's a consideration to start using the LFA, which is the quick turnaround test standard. So moving away from PCR, and particularly in the case of managing travel and tourism, having just a very quick point of care kind of a diagnostic. And then you have New Zealand, where the prevalence is extremely low, but the government, I think, has taken a bit more of a conservative stance, whereby they're really not interested in exploring the quick turnaround, the LFA method. They still want to use the gold standard. So can you kind of talk about what this means in the different contexts and how it impacts the decision making?
Right. So maybe I'll just do some numbers for you, and then maybe it'll make a little bit of sense because this is a judgment call. There's no black and white here where this is the right time for you to do it, and some of it as well is public sentiment. How willing are they to submit to basically being tested? Right? Everybody being tested. And how much resource does a particular country have to not only do the testing, but to do all the follow-up? Okay? Because there's going to be a lot of, especially in low prevalence, there's going to be a lot of false false positives,
Yeah.
which means what do you do with all those people?
Yeah, so that would be like New Zealand, which is extremely low prevalence.
Yes, that's right. So I'm gonna give an example. Let's say your test has a 99.5% specificity.
Yeah.
Right? Very, very good.
Yeah.
Like in terms of the world diagnostics.
Closer to gold standard.
Very close to gold standard. Okay. But your prevalence is very, very low. So let's say it's 0.06%. Okay. So in that population, let's say we do 2,000 tests. What's your chances that there is one person in that 2,000 people that actually have the disease?
Yeah.
You're basically like at 1.
Right,
Okay?
right.
But because your specificity is 99.5%,
Yeah.
you're going to have about 10 false positives in that 2,000.
So you've got one guy and 10 who don't have it.
Yes,
but
exactly.
have been flagged.
But they're all going to be test positive.
Sure,
Okay.
sure.
So your positive predictive value is only 9.1%.
9.1% because it's 1 out of 10.
1 out of 11.
1 out of
technically.
11, sorry.
Yeah,
Okay.
Right? So 1
yeah.
out of 11.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So you're like, that's a terrible test. If you look at it that way,
Yeah.
it's like, why do I do a test when I'm only right 1 in 11 times?
Sure.
Right? That's
Sure.
an awful test,
Sure,
right? If you do
sure.
it that way. But it's not the test's fault. Okay?
yeah.
It's just how the math works out and how prevalence works out. Because if you go to a place where it's high prevalence, so let's say we're now in a location that has 12%.
Yeah.
Okay, prevalence
Yeah.
in the community, and you do 2,000 tests. Well, there you have 200 people that have the disease,
Yeah.
and you will have 9 false positives,
Yeah, that's
right? So
yeah.
now you're taking 200 divided by 209,
Yeah.
and you have a 96% a positive predictive value.
Yeah.
Okay, suddenly
Sure.
it becomes like, oh, that's a really great test. It's the same test, but because of prevalence, it changes the value of the test.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we have to talk about why or why not certain countries are trying to do it.
Right.
Public opinion plays a big part, and business sentiment also plays a big part.
Yeah.
Because if if let's say the retail sector or the F&B sector, basically service sector, is really struggling,
Yeah.
but overall prevalence in the community is low, but there's so much, let's say, reluctance to go back into the malls or whatever have you to use all these services, the government may choose to do this
Yeah.
to increase public sentiment that it's safe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So there's different reasons why you might want to do it, but it's not necessarily the same in all communities.
Right. So but the concerned citizenry, which could be a vocal minority, vocal majority, I'm not sure, will kind of ask, because they may not understand the probabilities associated, why would we go to a less sensitive test if it means that, I mean, just because it's a better turnaround, it's more convenient, why would you put everyone else at risk, putting aside the economic, which obviously is a consideration, because people will then say that, lives are very important and you can't put a value on, what if someone gets ill and someone dies, when my grandmother dies, because you're using a test that's less sensitive and letting people in, travelers who you may not have detected. What now for the population?
Well, I think that's why quarantine exists.
Right. But in this case, they're talking about using the RAK without a quarantine.
Yeah, so I think there's not going to be a perfect solution for that.
Yeah.
So ideally, before the person gets on the flight, they would at least minimally quarantine themselves for 4 days.
Done the right decision.
Yeah, at least 4 days.
Done the right thing.
Because that's probably the very minimum before you have any, antibodies.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether they're using antigens tests that often, but whatever.
I think it's antigen.
Okay.
I think it's meant to be antigen.
Okay.
Yeah.
So basically, you need to have a requisite minimal number of days before you have enough of it in your system to be detected. So whatever the limit of detection of that test that you're using, you have to trace back and say,
you gotta try to be as infectious as you possibly can before you get on a plane with everyone else.
That's right. So it means
counterintuitive.
No matter what, you have to quarantine X number of days before you take the test.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you get on a plane and you have some certainty level, and then you come out the other side. At the other side, you also probably should wait basically a few days, because again, none of these tests are 100% sensitive or specific. So somebody in that plane could be
Yeah.
a false
Yeah,
negative,
yeah, yeah.
right?
This is also problematic.
Yeah.
Everything is a problem.
Everything is a problem, especially, because it's like, what's the chances, right? And literally, it's telling you the chances, because most of the tests, you're still talking in like the 99%
Yeah.
already considered very good.
Yeah,
So you
yeah.
almost have to, when you're talking about millions of people,
Yeah.
you have to push your sensitivity to like 99.999.
Right.
I don't know how many,
Right.
before you get to the point where you can say, yeah, it's fine. No
Yeah.
matter how many people come on the plane, no matter how low the prevalence is, like the chances are we're only going to miss one or two.
Yeah.
Like it's very hard to say that.
Right.
Okay. And so that's why, it's not just for COVID. A lot of tests, generally speaking, are not used for mass screening for this reason. If it's of low prevalence. And that's why they say, like, okay, now you're over 65,
Yeah.
your chances of getting X is much higher, and you are in the demographic, so for example, male, whatever, like a certain weight or whatever. Okay, let me do this diagnostic test for you. Because then the chances are that prevalence in that population is much higher.
Right.
And so you have a much better hit rate, basically, of having a true positive as a result. So there are very few tests that are just blanket, like everybody take them, right? Because there are very few diseases that are so prevalent that you want everybody to take them.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's why it complicates things. So we talked about two kinds of tests, but I want to throw out there as well. There are other kinds of tests that are being used.
Such as, go
So
on.
like ELISA tests.
Yeah.
So basically these are what I call often sandwich assays. It's a very similar principle to a lateral flow test, but it's done in a lab format. Okay, so usually
Done in a lab.
Yeah, it's done in the lab quite often. So you have plates, usually what we call a 96 well plate, because there are 96 holes, little holes, where you can have liquid in and you can do your test. And so it's done in batch format, and which is why it also can be cheap and let's say workflow wise efficient, scalable. And those can be very sensitive because they are usually more sensitive than the lateral flow test.
Right.
Because the lateral flow test, the speed at which the liquid flows through is actually pretty important.
Yeah.
And the quantities of medium that get put on the lateral flow also has much bigger variability than in a lab setting where everything is like precisely controlled.
Yeah.
All these margin of error stuff that you do in what we call a point of care device adds usually to the error of the test.
Yes.
If your test strip instructions say drop 3 drops, right, and they did 2.5, how does that affect your test?
Sure.
Right? Or if it says read the line after 15 minutes, but they were busy and they read it at 18 minutes. Does that change the result? Right? So all these things contribute to accuracy issues.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why as well, a lot of healthcare providers are not so eager to provide these just like ad hoc to everyone to do in your homes.
For sure.
Because the chances of having a lot of false negatives and false positives are quite high.
Right.
So a lot of these lateral flow tests, when they're packaged to be done in a home setting, there are years of what we call human factors engineering gone into them to try to make them as robust as possible. As robust as possible. And it's not just even the people, it's like how you transport them, what temperature they're kept at, the shelf stability.
That's right.
They spend a lot of time engineering for those things in these home use tests.
Yeah.
And so when you're talking about it in an emergency use scenario, it's very hard for these to come out on the market right away.
Yeah.
Right? Because you haven't had the chance to test a lot of these things, right?
Yeah.
And you haven't had the best amount of time to make sure that it's super robust for the end user.
Right.
And that's where you get all the problems down the road. If you looked at the tests that first launched in the early days, their sensitivity would not have passed. A lot of them, their sensitivity would not have passed a normal, let's say, regulatory standard.
Really? Okay.
Because the way that you judge, how do you determine what the sensitivity and specificity is? Well, basically, you use a bunch of samples, bank samples, blind. You don't know which ones are positive and which ones are negative, but you run them through your test. and then you mark down. This one said yes, this
Yeah.
one is no. And then
Yeah.
you calculate how many true positives that you have, how many true negatives that you have, how
Yeah.
many false positives, right? And that's how you calculate sensitivity and specificity. Well, that also depends on your population. Right? Because if your samples only had so many, so few,
Yeah.
or, they were at such late stage, it was easy to detect.
Yeah.
And then another test that was done in a different area had a much more variable set of samples to deal with.
Yeah.
And so then you only know in the context of that test,
Yeah.
right? And that's why a lot of clinical labs around the world, when they bring in a new test into their lab, they don't just look at the box and say, this is 99%.
Yeah.
So I'm going to trust this 99%.
They test it.
They test it, right? They run
When you say they, who's they?
laboratorians.
Like, not the regulatory body.
Not often.
Oh, really?
So it depends, right? So it depends on the country
Yeah.
as well, which also is kind of an interesting thing.
Yeah.
So increasingly, medical devices, not just diagnostics, are being required to be tested in the population
In the local
that they're meant
context, yes.
for. Okay,
That's right.
because there is difference
Yeah,
between demographics and genetics
Right.
and stuff like that, which
Right.
some tests are more, and especially for these infectious disease
Yeah.
tests, the disease is different from country to country. There are different
That's right.
strains.
Different strains, that's
So
right.
if you created a test for an American strain
Yeah.
and you bring it to Southeast Asia, how accurate is it for a local strain,
Yeah.
right? And that's why, if you develop the test locally, the chances are you're going to be more accurate for your local strain.
Right.
And we've seen this across the board. So tuberculosis is a popular one. And you see, even though there are perfectly good,
Yeah.
commercialized kits out there
Yeah.
for various diseases, a number of hospitals around the world will still try to do their own
Right.
because it's just more
I
adapted
see.
for their local
I see.
strain.
Okay.
Because whatever you do, usually what happens is you optimize your assay based on the samples that are around you. Whatever you're taking in to test against,
Yeah.
the chances that you're going to
Yeah.
be better at those
Yeah.
is much higher than somewhere else.
That was QALYfied, the podcast. Tune in next week to hear part 2 of our discussion, where we go into the role of regulation and reimbursement pathways in getting innovation to market. If you like what you heard, please leave a positive review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever good podcasts are found, and recommend QALYfied to a friend.